The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed through Whitaker's auto repair, a symphony of wrenches and ratchets that Darnell conducted with practiced ease. Grease stained his hands, a testament to his honest labor, a badge he wore with quiet pride. The scent of motor oil and gasoline hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort, a scent that spoke of hard work and honest pay. Beneath the raised hood of a battered Ford pickup, he tightened a bolt, his brow furrowed in concentration. The truck belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, a kindly couple whose weathered faces mirrored the age of their vehicle. Their worried whispers, overheard earlier about their grandson's graduation ceremony in St. Louis, had spurred him on, pushing him past his usual closing time. He'd promised them he'd have it fixed, and Darnell Whitaker was a man of his word. A quick glance at the clock on the wall brought a knot of anxiety to his stomach. 3:45, damn. Rochelle would be waiting. Their lunch reservation at May and Oral, that fancy French place she'd been wanting to try, was at 4 o'clock. He'd envisioned a leisurely afternoon, a chance to escape the grime and grease, to see the smile bloom on Rochelle's face as he pulled out her chair, a small gesture of appreciation for her unwavering support. He wiped his hands on a rag, the grime clinging stubbornly, a physical reminder of the divide between his world and the polished elegance of May and Oral. A pang of guilt twisted inside him. He'd promised Rochelle this, a break from their usual routine, a taste of something special. He knew how much she looked forward to these small escapes, these moments of shared joy amidst the everyday struggles. He hoped she wouldn't be too disappointed. He could almost hear her voice, gentle but laced with a hint of teasing, reminding him of his tendency to get lost in his work. He pictured her sitting at their small kitchen table, a mug of tea warming her hands, a patient, understanding smile playing on her lips. He owed her this. He had to make it up to her. "Almost done, folks," he announced, his voice carrying a warmth that belied the urgency he felt. Mr. Henderson patted his shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're a lifesaver, Darnell. Don't know what we'd do without you." Mrs. Henderson, a small woman with eyes that held a lifetime of stories, echoed her husband's sentiment, her voice trembling slightly with gratitude. "Bless your heart, Darnell. You're a good man." Their words, simple yet heartfelt, resonated deep within him. It was this connection to his community, this quiet satisfaction of helping others, that fueled him, that made the long hours and the grime worthwhile. He'd always believed in the power of honest work, the dignity of labor, even when others looked down on it. He thought of May and Oral, its gleaming facade, its air of exclusivity. He wondered, fleetingly, if they valued this kind of honesty, this quiet dedication to something beyond the superficial. He pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. He was doing this for Rochelle, for their shared moment, for the chance to see the sparkle in her eyes. He finished tightening the last bolt, the metallic click a final punctuation mark on his labor. He wiped down the engine, a meticulous habit ingrained over years of practice. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was racing against time, against the unspoken expectations of a world that often judged him by his appearance, by the grease under his fingernails, rather than the content of his character. "All set," he declared, closing the hood with a decisive thud. "Should be good as new." He explained the repairs in simple terms, avoiding the technical jargon he often used with other mechanics. He watched as they climbed into the truck, their faces etched with relief. Mr. Henderson started the engine, the sound a reassuring rumble. He gave Darnell a grateful wave as they pulled away, leaving a trail of dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. He stood for a moment, watching them go, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging that transcended the pressures of time and social expectations. He knew he was late, significantly late, but he wouldn't trade the feeling he had now for anything. He quickly washed his hands, the grime resisting, a stubborn reminder of his world, his reality. He changed into a clean shirt, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against his skin. He smoothed it down, aware that no matter how clean he was, he would still carry the scent of his trade, the invisible mark of his labor. He glanced at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the sink. He saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the calloused hands, the grease stains that lingered despite his efforts. He saw Darnell Whitaker, the mechanic, the man who valued honesty and hard work above all else. He saw the man Rochelle loved. He hoped it would be enough. He locked up the shop, the metallic click of the lock echoing in the quiet street. He hurried towards his truck, his mind racing, a mix of anticipation and apprehension swirling within him. He knew Rochelle would understand. She always did. But a part of him, a small, nagging voice, couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a world that wasn't meant for him, a world that valued appearances above everything else. He pushed the thought aside, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, the rumble of the engine a familiar comfort in the face of the unknown. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, stretching towards Mayen Oral, a silent sentinel in the distance. The heavy oak door of Mayen Oral yielded with a hushed sigh, releasing a wave of cool, perfumed air that washed over Darnell and Rochelle. The transition from the sun-baked Missouri street into the restaurant's dimly lit interior was almost disorienting. Darnell blinked, his eyes adjusting to the subtle shift from bright daylight to the soft glow of strategically placed wall sconces. Crystal chandeliers, hanging like frozen fireworks overhead, cast fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor. The air hummed with a low, almost subliminal thrum of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of silverware against fine china. He inhaled, catching the complex aroma of aged wine, something buttery and rich simmering in a distant kitchen, and the faint, almost metallic scent of expensive perfume. For a moment, Darnell felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't his world. He was more comfortable amidst the clang of his workshop, the sharp tang of motor oil, the predictable rhythm of a well-tuned engine. He glanced at Rochelle, hoping she hadn't sensed his momentary hesitation. Rochelle, oblivious to his inner turmoil, was already captivated. Her eyes, usually filled with the gentle warmth he knew so well, now sparkled with a childlike wonder. She smoothed the fabric of her dress, a simple yet elegant navy blue number he'd helped her pick out, and a small, almost shy smile played on her lips. Seeing her pleasure, his unease began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. This was for her. This meticulously planned lunch, this foray into a world so unlike their own, was his gift to her. They approached the hostess stand, a gleaming mahogany structure that looked more like a piece of art than a functional piece of furniture. A young woman with impeccably styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine looked up from a reservations book. Her eyes, cool and assessing, swept over them, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on Darnell's worn jeans and the faint grease stains that stubbornly clung to his work shirt. The smile faltered, replaced by a look that Darnell recognized a mixture of disdain and thinly veiled pity. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. It was the look he often received when stepping into establishments that didn't cater to his kind, the working class, the grease-stained, the calloused-handed. He had learned to ignore it, to build a wall around himself against the subtle barbs of judgment. But today, with Rochelle beside him, the sting was sharper. Hi. Can I help you?" the hostess asked, her voice laced with a hesitant sweetness that felt entirely insincere. Darnell noticed the way she subtly adjusted her posture, putting a slight distance between herself and them. "I've got a reservation," Darnell replied, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the complex emotions churning within him. He gave his name, his gaze holding the hostess's with quiet intensity. He wouldn't allow her to dismiss him. Not today. The hostess's eyes flickered down to her book, her fingers tracing the neatly printed lines. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker, I see it," she said, her voice losing some of its initial saccharine quality. She paused, a delicate frown creasing her brow. We do have a dress code, and well," her words trailed off, leaving the unspoken judgment hanging heavy in the air. Darnell felt Rochelle tense beside him. He could almost feel the heat radiating from her, a silent testament to her rising anger. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers, a silent plea for patience. "I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable," Darnell said, his voice still even, but with an underlying steel that surprised even himself. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was offering her a way out, a chance to retract her thinly veiled insult with a modicum of grace. The hostess's cheeks flushed a delicate pink. She glanced around the almost empty restaurant, her gaze avoiding Darnell's. She seemed momentarily flustered, caught between the rigid enforcement of an arbitrary rule and the quiet dignity of the man before her. The silence stretched, each tick of the ornate grandfather clock in the corner amplifying the tension. Inside, a storm raged within Darnell. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, at the injustice of the situation. He had worked hard, honestly, all his life. He had saved for months to bring Rochelle to this place, to give her a taste of the luxury she deserved. And now, this young woman, this gatekeeper of superficiality, was judging him, dismissing him based on the clothes on his back. He wanted to lash out, to demand an apology, to make her understand the casual cruelty of her actions. But another part of him, a deeper, more ingrained part, urged restraint. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He wouldn't let her prejudice diminish the joy he wanted to share with Rochelle. Rochelle's hand tightened in his. He could feel the tremors running through her, the barely suppressed fury she was holding within. He knew she was ready to explode, to defend him with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cub. He squeezed her hand, a silent message of reassurance. He would handle this, his way. The truck's engine rumbled to life, a low, guttural sound that mirrored the unease churning in Darnell's stomach. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He could feel Rochelle's gaze on him, a tangible weight in the close confines of the cab. He didn't meet her eyes. He focused instead on the street ahead, the blurring of colors and shapes a distraction from the tight coil of shame that threatened to unravel him. He hadn't expected the sting of rejection to be so sharp, so public. He'd dealt with subtle prejudice before, the sideways glances, the muttered assumptions. But this blatant dismissal, this casual cruelty disguised as decorum, had exposed a raw nerve. It had stripped him bare, revealing the insecurities he'd spent years carefully burying beneath layers of quiet competence and hard work. Rochelle reached out, her hand warm and gentle on his forearm. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft, edged with concern. He forced a smile, a pale imitation of the real thing. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. The lie hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension in the small space. He wanted to tell her the truth, to confess the sudden, overwhelming urge to disappear, to become invisible, to scrub off the stain of that woman's condescending stare. But the words wouldn't come. Pride, a stubborn, self-destructive pride, held them captive. "Just didn't want to ruin your lunch," he added, a weak attempt at levity that fell flat. Rochelle's hand tightened on his arm. He could feel the unspoken questions in her touch, the silent empathy that always saw straight through his carefully constructed facade. She knew him. She knew the quiet dignity that masked a deep well of sensitivity. She knew the hours he poured into his work, the pride he took in his skill, the quiet satisfaction he derived from fixing things, from bringing order to chaos. And she knew how this casual dismissal, this judgment based solely on appearances, had chipped away at that carefully constructed sense of self-worth. He knew she wanted him to share his feelings, to unload the burden of humiliation. But some wounds, he felt, were best left to heal in the quiet solitude of one's own heart. He pulled the truck over, the sudden stop a physical manifestation of the turmoil within him. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, a silent dialogue between two souls intimately intertwined. He turned to her, finally meeting her gaze. Her eyes, usually bright and sparkling, were shadowed with concern. He saw the mixture of anger and sheen tongue in their depths, emotions mirroring his own. He wished he hadn't brought her here. He wished he hadn't subjected her to this. He reached out, his calloused fingers tracing the delicate curve of her cheek. "We'll go somewhere else," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Somewhere that appreciates a good mechanic." The faintest hint of a smile played at the corner of his lips, a fragile bloom pushing through the cracks of his wounded pride. Rochelle's answering smile was a balm to his bruised spirit. She leaned into his touch, her warmth a tangible comfort. "Anywhere with you is fine," she whispered, her words a quiet affirmation of their shared world, a world where appearances held no sway over the deeper connections of the heart. He started the engine again, the rumble now a steady thrum of purpose. He knew where he wanted to go, not another restaurant, but somewhere familiar, somewhere that offered solace and a quiet sense of belonging. His workshop, the scent of oil and grease, the familiar clink of tools, the rhythmic hum of machinery, these were the things that grounded him, the things that reminded him of his own intrinsic worth. He'd spend the afternoon immersed in the familiar rituals of his craft, losing himself in the intricate dance of metal and mechanics. He'd find solace in the act of creation, in the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. But first, there was something he needed to do. He pulled out his phone, his fingers scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: Ronald Beckett. Ronald, a wealthy investor in May and Oral, and, more importantly, a loyal customer of Darnell's, a man who appreciated his skill and his integrity. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. He wasn't one for confrontation, not one for seeking retribution. He preferred the quiet path, the subtle shift, the ripple effect that caused change without fanfare. He took a deep breath, steeling his resolve. He wasn't calling to complain. He wasn't calling to seek revenge. He was calling to plant a seed. The phone rang, each ring echoing the steady beat of his heart. He glanced at Rochelle, her hand still resting on his arm, a silent source of strength. "Ronald," he said when the call connected, his voice calm and even, betraying none of the turmoil that still simmered beneath the surface. "Darnell here. Listen, I had a bit of an odd experience at May and Oral just now." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a pregnant pause filled with unspoken meaning. He then proceeded to recount the incident, his tone measured and objective, devoid of any hint of anger or resentment. He simply stated the facts, letting the inherent injustice speak for itself. He knew Ronald. He knew his sense of fairness, his sharp business acumen, his understanding of the delicate balance between image and reality. He knew that the seed he'd planted would take root, that it would grow and flourish, ultimately bearing fruit in its own quiet, powerful way. He didn't need to ask for anything. He didn't need to demand justice. He simply needed to plant the seed and let it grow. The aroma of frying onions and sizzling bacon hung heavy in the air, a comforting, familiar scent that grounded Darnell in the simple reality of the diner. He watched Rochelle across the red vinyl booth, the way the afternoon sun caught the highlights in her hair, the slight furrow of her brow as she stirred her coffee. He'd seen that look before, the quiet contemplation that sometimes masked a storm brewing beneath. He knew she was still processing the incident at May and Oral, replaying the humiliation, the blatant dismissal. He swallowed the lump in his own throat, the bitter taste of injustice lingering. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted to spoil their day, their attempt at something special. Rochelle met his gaze, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "This burger is actually pretty good," she said, her voice softer than usual. He knew it was an attempt to lighten the mood, to reassure him. He appreciated the effort, the unspoken understanding between them. He nodded, picking up his own burger, the simple act feeling strangely weighty. He forced a bite, the taste bland compared to the phantom flavors of the French cuisine they'd anticipated. "Better than some snooty French place?" she added, a hint of defiance now coloring her tone. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Maybe," he admitted, though a part of him still felt the sting of being judged unworthy, of being reduced to his work clothes. The grease stains on his shirt suddenly felt like a brand, marking him as an outsider, someone not good enough for their polished world. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the warmth of Rochelle's hand covering his. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Ronald's number. Hesitation flickered within him. Did he really want to pull that string, to use his connection to this wealthy client? It felt uncomfortable, like admitting defeat. But then he looked at Rochelle again, saw the remnants of hurt in her eyes, and the hesitation vanished. He pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Ronald's cheerful voice boomed through the speaker. Darnell, everything all right with the car? Took her for a spin this morning, purrs like a kitten. Darnell took a deep breath, the diner's noise fading into background hum as he focused on the conversation. Car's fine, Mr. Beckett, but something else happened. He paused, the words catching in his throat. Rochelle squeezed his hand, a silent encouragement. Oh, what's up? Ronald's voice was laced with concern. Darnell recounted the incident at Mayan Oral, keeping his voice even, devoid of any overt anger or accusation. He simply stated the facts, the hostess's condescending questions, her dismissive gesture, the humiliating retreat. He even downplayed Rochelle's distress, not wanting to embellish the story, wanting it to speak for itself. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the faint clatter of dishes. Then, Ronald's voice, sharp with disbelief, cut through the quiet. You're joking? That little you're telling me, they turned you away? The incredulity in his voice was a balm to Darnell's wounded pride. He swallowed, the lump in his throat finally dissolving. Yeah, he said quietly. Guess my overalls weren't up to their standards. He could almost hear Ronald's mind racing, connecting the dots, realizing the absurdity of the situation. Darnell had meticulously rebuilt Ronald's prized vintage Porsche, a task that required not just skill, but an almost artistic touch. And yet, here he was, being turned away from a restaurant because of his appearance. The irony was thick, almost suffocating. Darnell, Ronald's voice was low, controlled now. I apologize. I can't believe this happened. Mayan Oral, I have certain connections there. This is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and potent. Darnell felt a surge of something complex, not quite satisfaction, but a sense of vindication, a quiet affirmation of his worth. He didn't need to say anything. He simply listened as Ronald promised to take care of it, the phrase echoing with unspoken power. He disconnected the call, a strange calmness settling over him. He looked at Rochelle, her eyes wide, a mixture of surprise and relief on her face. He reached across the table, his fingers intertwining with hers. He didn't need to explain, didn't need to justify his actions. The shared understanding between them, forged through years of quiet support and unspoken trust, was stronger than any words. The diner's mundane noises, the clatter of plates, and the murmur of conversations, suddenly seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet anticipation, a silent acknowledgement of the storm gathering on the horizon. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, painting a warm glow on Rochelle's face, a promise of brighter days to come. The simple act of holding her hand, of feeling her warmth against his, anchored him, reminding him of what truly mattered, of the values that transcended superficial judgments and societal labels. The greasy stains on his shirt no longer felt like a brand, but a testament to his hard work, to his honest labor, to the man he was, regardless of what some pretentious hostess might think. The muted clinking of silverware against fine china, the hushed murmur of conversations, the gentle strains of a violin, the symphony of Mayan Oral, usually a balm to Ronald Beckett's soul, grated on his nerves this afternoon. He swirled the amber liquid in his snifter, the ice cubes clicking softly, a counterpoint to the disquiet churning within him. He'd seen him, hadn't he? That mechanic, the one with the calloused hands and the quiet dignity, standing outside just moments ago, brushed off like lint from an expensive suit. Ronald recognized the man. He knew the strength in those hands, the meticulous care they took with the complex machinery of Ronald's vintage Aston Martin. He knew the honesty in the man's eyes, the kind of honesty that was rarer than any first-edition car. He'd seen it every time he'd visited the small, unassuming garage, a stark contrast to the gleaming facade of Mayoral. The thought of that quiet dignity being dismissed so casually, so thoughtlessly, tightened a knot in Ronald's stomach. He set the snifter down, the crystal ringing faintly against the polished mahogany. He couldn't enjoy this, not today, not after what he'd witnessed. He beckoned a waiter, the gesture precise, controlled. "Could you please inform Mr. Jackson that I'd like a word?" His voice was low, even, but carried an undercurrent of steel. The waiter, startled by the intensity in those usually affable eyes, quickly nodded and hurried away. Ronald watched him go, his gaze drifting back to the entrance. The mechanic was gone. The injustice of it lingered in the air, a subtle but pervasive odor like burnt sugar. He thought of the mechanic's wife, the delicate way she'd held his hand, the worry etched on her face. It wasn't just the man who had been insulted. It was their shared anticipation, their planned escape from the everyday. It was a violation of something sacred, something Ronald understood intimately. Clive Jackson, the general manager, arrived shortly, his face a carefully arranged mask of professional cordiality. "Mr. Beckett, what a pleasure. Is everything to your satisfaction?" His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He knew Ronald wasn't one for idle chatter. "No, Clive," Ronald said, his voice still low, but now laced with a discernible frost. "It's not." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. "I witnessed something rather unpleasant outside a few minutes ago. A gentleman, a hard-working man, was refused service because of his attire." Clive's smile faltered. "I assure you, Mr. Beckett, we have a dress code. It's clearly stated at the entrance." His tone was defensive, a hint of irritation creeping in. He dealt with difficult customers all the time, but Ronald Beckett was different. Ronald Beckett was an investor. "Dress code?" Ronald echoed, a flicker of something cold in his eyes. "You looked at that man and decided he didn't belong. You saw his work clothes, the grease stains on his hands, and you made a judgment about his worth." He took a slow breath, the control he exerted over himself palpable. "That's not a dress code issue, Clive. That's a respect issue." Clive shifted uneasily. He'd seen that look before, the quiet stillness that preceded a storm. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend the restaurant's policy, but the words caught in his throat. Ronald's influence extended far beyond Mayoral. He was a man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. "Mr. Beckett, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding," he stammered, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. Perhaps the hostess was overzealous. "We will address the situation." He dabbed at his forehead with a silk handkerchief, a nervous tic he usually kept well hidden. Ronald's gaze was unwavering. "A misunderstanding? Clive, I know that man. He's one of the most honest, hard-working individuals I've ever met. He fixes my cars, and he does it with a level of skill and dedication that's rare these days." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He deserved better than to be judged by his appearance. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clive swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He knew he was cornered. "Of course, Mr. Beckett, you're absolutely right. I will personally apologize to the gentleman and ensure that this never happens again." The words fell hollow, even to his own ears. Ronald nodded, the faintest hint of a softening in his expression. "Good. And Clive," he added, his voice regaining some of its usual warmth, "perhaps you should consider retraining your staff. Teach them to see beyond the superficial, to recognize the inherent dignity in every individual, regardless of their attire." He paused, his gaze distant, thoughtful. "Sometimes the most valuable people aren't the ones dressed in the finest clothes, but the ones with the cleanest hearts." Clive could only nod, a mixture of relief and apprehension swirling within him. He knew this incident would have repercussions. He knew he had to make changes, not just to appease Ronald Beckett, but to rectify a fundamental flaw in the way Mayoral operated. He'd seen the quiet dignity in the mechanic's eyes too, now that it had been pointed out. He'd seen the reflection of that dignity in Ronald's unwavering gaze. And in that reflection, he saw a glimpse of his own shortcomings. The symphony of Mayan oral, the clinking silverware, the hushed murmurs, the gentle strains of the violin, suddenly seemed discordant, a hollow mockery of elegance. He knew it would take more than a simple apology to restore the harmony. The clatter of cutlery against cheap plates faded as Darnell pushed his empty plate away. The lingering scent of fried onions and coffee clung to the air of the diner, a stark contrast to the imagined aroma of truffle oil and aged wine that had danced in his mind earlier that day. Rochelle, across the table, sipped her lukewarm coffee, her gaze fixed on the swirling cream, a small whirlpool of unspoken emotions in its depths. He knew she was reliving the humiliation, the sting of being dismissed, of being judged unworthy. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, a stark counterpoint to the elegant string quartet he'd envisioned serenading their lunch. He rubbed the grease stains still clinging stubbornly to his hands, the rough texture a tangible reminder of his life, his work, his identity. It felt heavy, heavier than usual. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a low thrum against his leg. Ronald Beckett. Darnell hesitated, a ripple of anxiety tightening his chest. He'd hoped for this call, yet the anticipation felt like a taut wire stretched thin, threatening to snap. "Mr. Beckett," he answered, his voice quieter than intended. Rochelle's gaze lifted, questioning, searching his face. "Darnell," the investor's voice boomed through the receiver, a wave of affluence and power crashing over the humble diner setting. "I just wanted to let you know things have been rectified. A formal apology will be issued." And, he added, a touch of satisfaction coloring his tone, "the dress code policy is under review." Darnell lowered the phone, a strange mix of relief and emptiness settling in his stomach. He'd wanted acknowledgement, validation, a recognition that the judgment he faced was unjust. Yet, now that it had come, wrapped in the influence of a wealthy benefactor, it felt hollow. He looked at Rochelle, her eyes reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights, holding a universe of unsaid words. "It's done," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the triumph he should have felt. Rochelle reached across the table, her hand covering his, her touch grounding him in the present. The warmth of her skin seeped into his calloused fingers. "He stood up for you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That means something." He pulled his hand away, the emptiness in his chest growing, spreading like a cold shadow. "It doesn't change what happened," he replied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The humiliation, the dismissive glance of the hostess, the weight of assumptions based on appearances, those wounds remained, raw and throbbing. Ronald Beckett's intervention hadn't erased them. It had merely plastered over them with a thin veneer of corporate politeness. Rochelle's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. Disappointment? Anger? She took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken emotions. He watched her, his heart twisting with a strange mix of guilt and frustration. He didn't want her pity, her sympathy. He wanted understanding. He wanted her to see the invisible walls that had been erected around him, the silent judgments that had followed him his entire life, the constant struggle to prove his worth beyond the grease and grime of his profession. "Darnell," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper, "it's not about the apology. It's about the fact that someone saw it, saw you, saw the injustice." Her gaze held his, unwavering. "They saw you for who you are, not what you wear." Her words pierced through the fog of his thoughts, a sharp, clear note in the cacophony of his internal struggle. He looked at her, really looked at her, the worry etched on her brow, the understanding shimmering in her eyes. He'd been so focused on the surface wound, on the public humiliation, that he hadn't seen the deeper cut, the erosion of his own self-worth. He'd allowed the judgment of a stranger to define him, to diminish him in his own eyes. He knew Rochelle understood. She saw beyond the grease-stained hands and the worn work boots. She saw the quiet strength that resided within him, the resilience forged in the fires of prejudice and misunderstanding. She saw the man he was, not the caricature the hostess had created. "It's just," he started, his voice catching in his throat. "It's tiring, Rochelle. Always having to prove, to explain, to justify." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture weary. "It's tiring being judged by the cover, when the story inside is so much more." Rochelle's hand found his again, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know," she said, her voice laced with empathy. "But you don't have to prove anything to me. And you shouldn't have to prove anything to anyone else." Her words were a balm to his wounded spirit, a gentle reminder of the truth he'd almost forgotten. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed. The scent of fried onions lingered, but the weight on his chest had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the invisible battles fought every day. He squeezed Rochelle's hand, the warmth of her touch a silent promise, a shared strength in the face of prejudice. The apology, the policy change, those were just ripples on the surface. The real change, the real victory, lay in the quiet understanding between them, in the unwavering affirmation of his inherent worth. It wasn't about the fancy restaurant, the expensive wine, or the perfectly pressed tablecloth. It was about being seen, about being valued, about being loved for who you were, grease stains and all. And in that moment, surrounded by the mundane normalcy of the diner, Darnell realized that he had found something far more precious than a perfect lunch. He had found a deeper connection, a stronger bond, forged in the crucible of an imperfect world. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, casting long shadows across the grease-stained concrete floor. The air, thick with the scent of motor oil and metal, clung to Darnell like a second skin. He wiped his hands on a rag, the grime clinging stubbornly to the creases, a testament to a day's honest work. Outside, the city was exhaling, the rush-hour traffic a distant growl. Here, in the sanctuary of Whitaker's Auto Repair, the only sound was the rhythmic clinking of Rochelle's spoon against the plastic container. Peach cobbler. Rochelle always knew the way to soothe his soul. He watched her, the soft glow of the shop lights illuminating the delicate curve of her cheek. Earlier that day, that same face had been etched with anger, her eyes flashing fire. He remembered the way her hand had tightened on his arm as they'd walked away from Mayan Oral, a silent declaration of solidarity. He'd felt a strange mix of gratitude and shame, grateful for her unwavering support, ashamed that he'd subjected her to such blatant disrespect. "This is good," Rochelle murmured, breaking the silence. She offered him a spoonful, her eyes searching his. He took it, the sweetness a balm on his raw nerves. He knew she wasn't just talking about the cobbler. She was talking about them, about the way they navigated the world, hand in hand, facing down the subtle, insidious stings of prejudice. He swallowed, the taste lingering on his tongue. "It is," he agreed, his voice rough. He wanted to tell her how much her support meant, how her belief in him was the bedrock of his existence. But the words felt clumsy, inadequate. He settled for a squeeze of her hand, hoping she understood the unspoken language of their shared life. Rochelle leaned her head against his shoulder, the familiar scent of her perfume mingling with the harsh industrial odors of the shop. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, the moment a small island of peace in a turbulent sea of memories. The hostess's condescending smile, the dismissive flick of her wrist, the cold, sterile elegance of the restaurant. It all felt distant now, muffled by the warmth of Rochelle's presence. "Maybe it's time they start seeing something else," Rochelle said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the backdrop of the humming lights. He knew what she meant. Not the grease on his hands, not the worn denim of his work pants, but the man beneath. The man who poured his heart and soul into every engine he repaired. The man who valued honesty and hard work above all else. The man she loved. "Money don't make you smart," he replied, his voice low and steady. "And it sure don't make you right or decent." The words weren't directed at Rochelle, but at the invisible wall of prejudice that seemed to separate him from the world beyond his shop. He'd spent his life navigating those walls, learning to anticipate their presence, to scale them with quiet dignity. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was simply tired. Tired of having to prove his worth, tired of being judged by the clothes on his back, tired of the constant, subtle reminders that he didn't belong. The rattle of the shop door broke the spell. Malik, his youngest apprentice, shuffled in, a styrofoam container in his hand. He looked at Darnell, a mixture of concern and respect in his eyes. "Mr. Whitaker," he said hesitantly, "I brought you this. From that tie place you like." Darnell looked at the young man, surprised. He hadn't spoken to Malik about the incident at Mayan Oral, but the gesture spoke volumes. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a silent declaration of allegiance. A flicker of warmth spread through Darnell's chest, chasing away the lingering chill of the afternoon's humiliation. He accepted the container, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Malik," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He saw Rochelle watching them, a knowing look in her eyes. He knew she understood the significance of the moment, the unspoken bond between him and the young man, the quiet power of respect earned, not demanded. It was a power that transcended money, status, and even appearances. It was the power of character, the power of a life lived with integrity. As Malik retreated to the back of the shop, Rochelle's hand found his again. "You see, Darnell," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. They see you." He looked at her, the fluorescent lights reflecting in her dark eyes, and he knew she was right. Malik saw him, Rochelle saw him, and maybe, just maybe, someday the world would see him too. Not the grease-stained mechanic, but the man beneath. The man who valued hard work, honesty, and a quiet, unwavering dignity. And in that moment, surrounded by the familiar smells and sounds of a shop, Darnell felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him, a peace deeper than any expensive French restaurant could ever offer. He knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his bones, that he was enough, just as he was. The scent of motor oil and metal hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort to Darnell. The rhythmic clang of a wrench against steel, the whir of the pneumatic drill, these were the sounds of his life, his livelihood, his sanctuary. Days had passed since the incident at Mayan Oral, days spent immersed in the familiar routine of his shop. Each turn of a bolt, each careful adjustment of a carburetor was a grounding ritual, a way to process the unsettling emotions that still lingered. He hadn't spoken much about it to Rochelle, not wanting to relive the humiliation, the sting of being judged unworthy. Yet, he felt her quiet understanding, a silent solidarity that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Rochelle, with her quiet strength, had simply squeezed his hand that evening, her eyes reflecting a depth of empathy that spoke volumes. He knew she saw the hurt beneath his composed facade, the tiny crack in his usual stoic demeanor. He'd tried to dismiss it, to bury it beneath the demands of his work, but the memory stubbornly refused to fade. He could still see the hostess's dismissive sneer, hear the barely concealed disdain in her voice. It wasn't the refusal itself that stung. It was the implication, the unspoken judgment that his work-stained clothes somehow diminished his worth. He ran a callous thumb across the smooth metal of the piston, the cool surface a stark contrast to the burning resentment that still simmered within him. The bell above the shop door chimed, drawing Darnell from his thoughts. He looked up, expecting to see a familiar face, a regular customer. Instead, he saw Clive Jackson, the manager of Mayan Oral, standing awkwardly near the entrance. Darnell's grip tightened on the wrench, a knot forming in his stomach. What could he possibly want? An explanation? An apology that would sound hollow and insincere? He watched as Jackson hesitantly approached, his expensive shoes looking strangely out of place on the oil-stained concrete floor. The man's face was pale, his usual air of polished confidence replaced by a nervous fidgeting. Darnell felt a flicker of something not satisfaction, not quite, but a quiet acknowledgement of the shift in power dynamics. He didn't raise his voice, didn't betray the complex emotions churning within him. He simply waited, his silence heavy with unspoken questions. "Mr. Whitaker," Jackson began, his voice strained, I've come to apologize." The words hung in the air, fragile and tentative. Darnell remained silent, observing the man's discomfort, the subtle tremor in his hands. He noticed the carefully chosen words, the practiced humility. Was it genuine remorse, or simply damage control? He couldn't be sure, and frankly, he didn't care. The apology wasn't for him, not entirely. It was for the unspoken slight, for the years of accumulated judgments based on appearances, for the quiet dignity he refused to surrender. "We were wrong," Jackson continued, his gaze finally meeting Darnell's. "Terribly wrong. The way you were treated, it was unacceptable. I've already terminated the hostess's employment and implemented new training protocols for all our staff. We're revising our dress code policy to reflect a more inclusive approach." Darnell listened, his expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't interrupt. He simply allowed the words to settle, to weigh them against the lingering sting of the injustice. He knew it wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been judged, dismissed, or overlooked because of their appearance. It was about the silent battles fought against prejudice, the quiet resilience that refused to be broken. "I understand that an apology can't undo what happened," Jackson said, his voice laced with a sincerity that surprised Darnell. "But I want you to know that we are committed to changing. We want to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of their attire." Darnell finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Jackson." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He didn't need elaborate apologies or grand gestures. He needed to see real change, a genuine shift in attitude, not just at Mayan Oral, but in the world beyond. Jackson nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He seemed to finally grasp the depth of the issue, the ripple effect of a seemingly small act of prejudice. He left soon after, his departure leaving a strange quiet in the shop. Darnell returned to his work, the rhythmic clang of metal against metal a soothing counterpoint to the turbulent thoughts still swirling in his mind. He knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by the familiar scents and sounds of his sanctuary, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded retribution. He had simply held on to his dignity, his quiet strength, and in doing so, had sparked a change, however small. The ripple effect of that quiet resistance continued to spread, a testament to the power of integrity in the face of prejudice. It was a call to action, a silent reminder that change begins with each of us in the quiet moments when we choose to stand up for what is right, even when our voices tremble.